Yes, would you ask Ms. Wray to come back in, please? Right, Ms. Wray.
Yes.
Are you ready to carry on?
Yes.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ms. Wray, we looked at the FRA for Grenfell Tower dated December 2010, 29th of December 2010. I now want to show you the Grenfell Tower FRAs in the period 2012 to 2016 with a focus on PEEPs. Can we start with the November 2012 FRA, please, at CST 403084. Section 13 on page 20, please. So I'm showing you the first page. We now need to look at page 20, section 13, same section, disabled people, same text. If you look in the commentary box this time, it says, at the time of the risk assessment, there was no evidence of any resident within the premises who suffers from sensory impairment to such a level that it would prevent them from hearing a shouted warning of fire. And then these words, or a loud knocking on their entrance door to warn them. And then if you look a little bit lower down, it says also that the use of the lifts, if you go over the page to 21, use of the lifts in the last line would be under the control of the fire service. You see that? Mm-hmm. Now, those are new words, particularly loud knocking on the entrance doors to warn them. Can you explain why those words came in?
No, sorry, I can't.
Did you ever ask Carl Stokes about why he thought it fit to add those words to what was otherwise a cut and paste standard version of comments to go into all these FRAs?
I may have done, but I don't recall.
Right. Well, we can just take this quite quickly then, skipping ahead to the October 2014 FRA for Grenfell Tower, CST 403151, page 21, section 13. We probably want page 20 for this. No, we don't. We're still on it. It's CST 403157, page 21, section 13, disabled people, middle of the page. It says exactly the same thing as the 2012 FRA, doesn't it?
Yeah, it seems to.
Yes, it seems to. Again, the April 2016 FRA, CST 403161, page 22. Same text again, both in respect of the you've got the same text, but this time in the April version, Mr. Stokes has stopped at shouted warning of fire. Do you know why the sentence added in the 2012 FRA about loud knocking has now been removed?
I don't know.
You don't. Did you ever ask him about these oddities?
I don't recall doing so.
Right.
Sorry.
Did you notice from time to time that the same information had been used again and again by Carl Stokes in section 13 of these FRAs?
Probably I did, yes.
Did you ever ask him about why he was just cutting and pasting from one to another?
No, I don't think I did.
Did it ever never give you cause for concern?
I suppose the fact, if I didn't raise it with him, then I must have not focused in on it.
Were you not concerned that he might be using out-of-date information, at least in this respect?
I should have been. I honestly can't recall.
No. Were you concerned that he wasn't independently assessing the needs of disabled people and fire safety measures in place at the time of each assessment afresh?
Yeah, in retrospect, yes, should have highlighted that.
But not at the time?
I can't specifically remember
Right.
whether we discussed it or not. Sorry, I just can't recall.
Right. Do you recall whether, if before or after his visit to carry out a fire risk assessment, Mr. Stokes ever asked you for up-to-date information about disabled persons at Grenfell Tower?
I don't recall him asking me.
In his second witness statement, he tells us that he wasn't asked to review or consider the TP tracker at all. For the reference for that is CST 3030186, page 38, paragraph 143. That's for our note. I don't need to show it to you. But is that correct, that he wasn't ever asked to review or consider the TP tracker?
He certainly wasn't asked to review it, as I think I said earlier, that would be confidential and personal data, and he wouldn't have access to that.
He didn't ask for access, and you didn't offer him access?
That's right.
Now, did you know that the TP tracker was discontinued in July 2013?
I do now.
Did you not know that at the time?
I wouldn't have known what House Management were using to obtain information on vulnerabilities. I knew they had various systems in place, and I wouldn't have known the detail. It wouldn't have necessarily been on my radar. I'm not sure I'd have ever been made aware of it.
Well, you say it wouldn't have been on your radar. I'm slightly puzzled by that, because the need to identify vulnerable residents was part of your responsibility, wasn't it, as a competent person?
Yeah, I'm not disputing that. What I'm saying is I wouldn't know what mechanism they were necessarily using.
Right. Oh, I see. I see what you mean. See, but if you didn't know that it had been discontinued in July 2013, what was the basis of the information? What was the database for that information and the system for collecting it after July 2013?
I think that's the point I'm obviously not making very well, is that I knew that they had systems in place. They weren't always the same system. I thought there had been lots of debate about whether there should be a tenancy audit. There were different ways that they considered obtaining the information, and I wasn't necessarily aware of which one was being trialled or being put in place at any one time.
Did you ever make any inquiries yourself into the information that the Tmo held elsewhere in its systems about disabled and vulnerable residents in Grenfell Tower between the dates 2010 and 2017?
I'm not sure that I made specific inquiries. I believe that when I was reviewing the fire strategy, I did try to clarify what we had in place and what level of information we had stored from my colleague David Noble, I think, but not in relation to any specific block, I don't think.
And I think from your earlier evidence this morning, just confirm, it's right, isn't it, that you never actually considered telling Carl Stokes that before he carried out each FRA, or rather when you gave him the list of FRAs to do, you never told him about the number of vulnerable residents that the TMO had identified in those buildings?
I don't believe I did, no.
And why is that?
It was clearly a major oversight. I can't give you any other explanation, I'm sorry.
In the 6.5 years between the 24th of September 2010 meeting and the Grenfell Tower fire, do you remember whether you ever had a meeting with him to bring him up to date with the steps that you and the TMO were taking to identify the needs of disabled persons, or who they were?
We would have had discussions and I think meetings with regard to specific actions that we were taking in relation to hoarders, in relation to people who installed security gates in front of their dwellings and delayed their rescue, and our discussions with the fire brigade and a way forward on those specific aspects. There were various ways we were trying to identify that I could easily access vulnerable people. I would have talked to him about those and perhaps a range of other things where we were putting in different sensory equipment. But beyond that, I can't recall.
I mean, if you didn't tell Carl Stokes about any disabled persons resident in Grenfell Tower, how were you going to ensure that the TMO complied with its obligations to identify occupants, especially at risk, in the fire risk assessments that were going to be carried out?
Just to go back to what I said this morning, what I was trying to do was to convey to my housing colleagues that they should refer people to me, individual residents who may or may not have had difficulties or had concerns or wanted reassurance or any number of fire safety related concerns. And as and when those people were made known to me, then we would make contact with them. Presumably the letter that you showed me this morning may have been one of those.
And how many of those individuals during that 6.5 year period did you pass on to Carl Stokes?
I've no idea. Sorry.
Well, right. He counted 2 PEEPs that he had been involved in preparing. 2.
Yeah.
Can you give us any idea of the number of individuals resident either in Grenfell Tower or generally across the stock that over the 6.5 years you passed back to Carl Stokes for his consideration?
I can't give you. What I can say is that a lot of the conversations and dialogue and the activity that was going on did not result in PEEP. So there was quite a lot of work going on that did not result in the production of a PEEP. That didn't mean that we weren't able to alleviate people's concerns and put in place things to assist them to be alerted to a fire or to respond to a fire. So in terms of PEEPs, there probably was not a lot of activity, but I feel sure there were occasions whenever I asked Carl to visit an individual resident who had raised a concern, plus Adrian and myself were doing that also, but I can't give you a volume.
Now, Carl Stokes, when one looks at all the other FRAs, appears to have included exactly the same paragraph in each one, that there were no disabled residents, or there was no evidence of any disabled residents in the FRAs for other properties other than Grenfell Tower. So let me show you an example of this. CST 404307. This is Adair Tower, FRA of the 28th of October 2010. And if we look at page 15, bottom of page, under disabled people, same text, same tick. And look, same text. At the time of the risk assessment, there was no evidence of any resident within the premises who suffers from a sensory impairment that would prevent them from hearing a shouted warning of fire. Mm-hmm. And then again, you see the now familiar text about the TP tracker system.
Yeah.
And then over the page, this information, the additional information will be used to assess if residents may require additional devices to provide them with early warning of smoke, fire in the home and or development of a PEEP. And then if we look at TMO 00854-930, this is Gilray House, the FRA dated 19th November 2012, page 18. Same text again. And he says again, no evidence of any resident within the premises who suffers from a sensory impairment. In fact, did you know that Carl Stokes had prepared a PEEP for a resident of Gilray House on the 18th of October 2010?
Yes.
Some 2 years before.
Yes.
So did you check whether the resident of Gilray House for whom that PEEP had been prepared 2 years prior was still living in that building when the 2012 FRA for it was completed?
I know the resident in question, it was her daughter it related to. I know the resident was, and I believe it remains there currently. I know the daughter has since gone to university, but I don't know at what date she went, so I can't say definitively whether she was still there at that stage or not.
Right. Did it not strike you as odd that Mr. Stokes, having done a PEEP, one of 2, it appears, for this resident of Gilray House 2 years prior, was able to say in this fire risk assessment that there was no evidence of any resident within the premises who suffers from sensory impairment, etc.?
Yes.
I mean, and even if the particular impairments to that particular resident were nothing to do with an oral impediment, hearing, nonetheless, it's odd, isn't it, that this appears here? Did it not strike you as odd at the time?
It mustn't have done.
Did you actually read these documents?
Yes, of course.
And if you read it and paid attention to it, would it not have struck you at the time that that was a peculiar sentence to put in?
I can only think that at the time, nobody had been brought to my attention either, so there weren't particularly warning signs.
In fact, if we go to CST 405609, we can see that here is an email from you to Carl Stokes on the 18th of November 2013. So this is a year after the Gilray House 19th November 2012 FRA. Mm-hmm. And you say here, and we need to go a third of the way down, C, 3 years ago you drafted a PEEP for Mrs. Blank's daughter, Mrs. Blank seeking another copy of this. No doubt she has her own agenda. But before we provide, could I ask you to make the following tweaks to this, please? And then you make some amendments. Now, it appears that the resident was still living in Gilray House at that time. So that's after the FRA.
It does.
So it would follow from that contemporaneous record that the FRA for Gilray House in November 2012 was factually incorrect to your certain knowledge when it says that there were no residents with known vulnerabilities in Gilray House.
It would, looking at that, yes.
Yeah. But you never asked Carl Stokes to amend his FRA or correct it in any way?
I don't recall doing, no. And yes, I should have done. And
Hazelwood Tower, let's look at one of those. 20th of February 2014 at TMO 100438004. Page 1, please, first to identify it. Page 20 to look at what I want to see. Section 13 at the foot of your screen, disabled people, same text, and now the same mantra-like statement in the first part of the commentary box. Yes?
yes,
And again, cut and paste, no change, one size fits all, as it appears.
as it appears.
Markland House, 21st of January 2016 at TMO 10045, TMO 100475159. Page 1 to start with, identify the document, 21st of January 2016, and page 21, please. Disabled people, section 13, same text, same tick box, yes, and same mantric statement at the beginning of the commentary box, yes?
Yes, and yet I thought Markland House was the other location.
Indeed, and you're right about that. Mr. Stokes had prepared a PEEP for a resident of Markland House on the 8th of March 2014, hadn't he? Yes, 2 years before this. Let's look at that. That's CST 3020896. There it is. I don't think I need the detail for it. My question is, did Mr. Stokes ask you if this resident was still living at Markland House when he undertook his FRA in January 2016, 2 years later?
I don't recall him asking.
Again, did you check if the resident was still living at Markland House in January 2016?
I don't recall doing that.
So it may be that a resident of Markland House may still have had a PEEP at the time of the FRA, and yet no mention was made of that by Mr. Stokes in his FRA.
It may have been, yes.
Finally, let's look at one more. Trellick Tower, April 2017, 26th of April 2017, I think the day before the fire there, actually. TMO 008422255. Page 1, please. There it is, and on page 24, we need the same section, section 13, disabled people, same text, same tick box, commentary box, that same paragraph, although this time we've got the loud knocking again added on for no apparent reason at the end of that sentence. Can you explain why all of these FRAs that we've looked at do not record any vulnerable residents in those properties across the time period we've been looking at, despite the presence of at least 2?
I can't.
And can you explain why, as we can see, although I don't think I've shown you in each of them, take it from me, that these FRAs in this part still will continue to refer to the TP tracker, even though its use was discontinued by the TMO as long before as 2013?
Only that he hadn't been updated with whatever had superseded TP tracker.
It looks from this that Carl Stokes was not provided with any up-to-date information about the presence of vulnerable persons in any of these properties for which he did FRAs, on the face of it.
Looks that way, yeah.
Even in respect of the 2 properties where we know that 2 persons had had PEEPs prepared for them.
Indeed.
How can you account for that state of affairs?
I can only say what I have said before, in that I was relying on my housing colleagues to refer people to me, so that I got the people who genuinely had concerns in relation to fire safety, whatever they may be. And when we received that information, we would investigate, interact with, try and provide whatever it is, either reassurance or actually physical help. Ultimately, if they needed a PEEP, then a PEEP would have been drafted. But as I've already said, we were constrained with not being able to provide any actual physical assistance. However, if that was what was required, we would have endeavoured to try and work that through. We potentially would have involved the fire brigade. We were doing that, and there's clearly a disconnect between the work that we were doing and that information going through to Carl that I didn't pick up at the time. And in addition, it looks like the PEEPs that he had done, I can't give an explanation why. If I'd been asked for information about whether those residents were still there, then I would have provided it, but I probably wouldn't have picked up on the need to do that unless I was prompted.
Did you come to an agreement with Carl Stokes not to record disabled persons in his FRAs?
No, I did not.
Did you come to an agreement with Carl Stokes not to assess the needs for all disabled and vulnerable residents in high-rise blocks?
No, I didn't.
Now, I want to look at the question of how PEEPs were covered in the fire safety policies and strategies, if we can. Can we look, please, at your November 2013 fire safety strategy, TMO 00830-598. We've seen this more than a number of times now, but there are so many parts of it we need to look at. This time we need to go to page 14, page 14, at paragraph 24.1, fire procedures. We looked at this together briefly before. Let's just revisit it. It covers staff, doesn't it? Staff who are not fully able-bodied.
It does, yes.
It doesn't refer to residents, does it?
It doesn't refer at this stage, no.
At this stage,
Well,
we know that the fire safety strategy was never updated or amended to cover residents.
I meant at this point in the document, but
I'm sorry, quite right.
it's fine. But you may well be right.
Okay. I mean, do you think that PEEPs for residents is covered anywhere else in this document?
I don't know. It's a 2013 document.
Yes.
I'm just commenting on the bit that you're showing me.
Do you know why there's no reference in this fire safety strategy, which was the operative or governing strategy as at the date of the Grenfell Tower fire, to PEEPs for residents?
I don't.
Only staff?
No, I don't, because, as you say, it's a small amount of evidence, but there is evidence that we have done them, and we would be willing to do them, and we were actively investigating residents' concerns and queries, which may or may not result in a PEEP, but it hopefully would alleviate concerns. So yeah, that should be included.
Well, yes. Let's go to page 16, 2 pages on.
Okay.
Now, in fact, that's not what I want. I'm so sorry. This is my fault. I'd like to show you the 2017 fire safety strategy, which was adopted the day before the fire, I think. If you go to TMO 00847-324, we've been looking at the 2013 version, at paragraph 24.1. Now we want the 2017 version. And if you look at 25.1 on page 15, the text is very similar to the 2013 version, isn't it?
Yes.
For staff who are not fully able-bodied and may need assistance, etc. You see that?
Yes.
Now, again, can you tell us why during the period between 2013 and 2017, no thought was given, it appears, to amending the 2013 strategy so as to provide for PEEPs for residents as opposed to, or as well as, staff?
I can't. Clearly, it should have been amended. But having said that, it probably should have been amended more frequently than it was.
Yes. And if we go to page 16 of this document, paragraph 28, Yes, thank you. We need page 16. That's it. 28. Hoarders and vulnerable residents. You can see the heading.
Yeah.
And if you go to paragraph 28.3, it says efforts are made to capture information about residents' vulnerability at sign-up as part of routine neighbourhood management work, tenancy auditing process, tenancy profiling process, and as part of our regular ongoing contact with residents. This information is used to offer the resident a service which better meets their needs, and this includes fire safety. Residents with sensory impairment will be offered the appropriate detection, etc. Now, does that accurately summarise the system for recording residents' vulnerability, at least as at the date of this policy?
I'm confident that that would have been that quote, vulnerability at sign up, and the associated text would have been given to me by neighbourhood housing management colleagues. So I think it will have done.
And how was that information captured, to use the word in the text, used to meet residents' needs in relation to fire safety?
As we said, it's captured, it's located wherever it's located, and the neighbourhood team have access to that information and regular contact with their residents and escalate it to the health and safety team.
And where was that information kept?
I don't know at that stage. Sorry, I wouldn't, as before, I wouldn't have had access to it. It would have come to me from the team with the permission of the resident, sorry.
Was it kept up to date after sign-up?
I don't know the answer to that. The information is owned by housing management. I'm assuming that I can only assume that there were processes in place to keep it updated. I'm sure it would have been an ongoing challenge, but I don't know. I can't answer that, sorry.
Do you know why there's no link between the contents of paragraph 28.3 and the reference to the capturing of information there and the preparation of PEEPs?
There definitely should be. I think clearly when I put it together, I've linked it to the hoarders and not directly to the PEEPs. Right.
Can we go to TMO 100244402, please? This is the TMO Health and Safety Policy from February 2016, signed by Robert Black. And as you can see from it, the only reference to PEEPs in here that we see is at page 6. If we go to page 6, you can see under section 10.3, employees with disabilities have their own individual personal emergency evacuation plan, which is regularly reviewed, and where necessary, their colleagues are trained in the safe use of the evacuation chair. Did you have input? I think you did, didn't you, into the drafting of this policy? Why, when you drafted that, did you not make the connection between having employees having their own PEEPs, but residents not?
Is there not a separate section in terms of resident safety, and does that not cover it? Sorry, because most of this looks like it's related to occupational locations. I can't remember how I put it together. We would often have tried to differentiate the sections that relate to resident safety and to employee safety, but I believe,
you ask me. I can scroll down through it, but there doesn't appear to be a distinction, at least on the face of the document, between residents on the one hand and employees on the other.
Okay, well then, in which case that's an error. That should be.
The thrust of this document is the RRO obligations in the workplace and protecting TMO employees, isn't it? I mean, you can scroll down it, please, and have a look at it and refresh your memory.
I mean, it's a health and safety policy statement. It's an organisational health and safety policy statement. So in the first instance, it's very much about the organisation. But obviously, in our case, that extends to the residents. But it probably doesn't have significant detail about residents, but just captures the main aspects of risk, potentially.
Now, this is a February 2016 document. Yes, before I leave this document, can I just show you on page 6, paragraph 10.1, there is a reference to FRAs in communal areas of residential blocks.
Right.
That is a reference to that. So you might say that is where residents are catered for, or at least referred to.
Well, I suppose what I'm saying is it's sort of employers are required to have this document. It's largely aimed at the organisation and the arrangements for health and safety in an organisation. So obviously, because our purpose was to house residents and protect them, then there is reference to residents as well, but it was focused on employees. So it doesn't have the level of detail that you would necessarily expect.
Now, can we go to TMO 00840-753? This is a minute of the Health and Safety Committee meeting of the 13th of September 2016. Mm-hmm. I think we looked at it yesterday. If we go to page 5 in this document, and we can see you were present from page 1, on page 5 it says under agenda item 6, review of the safety policy and strategy, BM thanked all who had provided comments on this policy. The committee reviewed the comments received and JW agreed to update so the reviewed draft could be presented to the next meeting. Specifically, the following amendments were agreed. And then you can see the first one, discussion around identifying vulnerable individuals, strategy to reflect new policy on vulnerability. Is this right? This was a discussion about the draft fire safety strategy at that time?
Yes.
Yes. What was the discussion around identifying vulnerable individuals?
I suspect it was what led to the text that eventually went into the updated draft. That I'm sorry, I can't recall whether Teresa Brown was at this meeting, but if she wasn't, she presumably would have had a deputy. I think it would have been her clarifying how housing management now obtain that information.
Do you know whether this was a reference to residents or to TMO employees?
Oh, this would have been about residents, definitely.
Why do you say that? Why are you so sure about that?
Discussion around identifying vulnerable individuals, and the policy. My understanding is, no, I don't have any doubt. It would definitely be residents,
right?
Because sorry, just to add that in terms of staff, line managers would have a responsibility for identifying any needs of their staff, and so it would be an HR route rather than a health and safety committee necessarily.
I see. Can you help me? What was the new policy on vulnerability?
I can't help you, sorry. I don't know the detail.
Do you remember whether it was a document that was drafted by David Noble in April 2016 called Supporting Residents?
It could be. Sorry, I don't know.
Right. David Noble told us that was what was discussed, but you can't help. Is that right?
Sorry, David Noble didn't sit on this committee, did he?
He drafted something called the Supporting Residents policy.
Yeah, he may well have done. Sorry, I thought you were referring to the comment here about the discussion on policy on vulnerability.
Was there an agreement for the fire safety strategy to reflect the new policy on vulnerability, whatever that was?
That seems to be what it says here, doesn't it?
Right. Now, if we go to TMO 00865-834, we look later on in the same year, 2016. This is an email from you to David Noble, at the foot of page 1 going over to page 2. You see the very foot of page 1. It's from you to David Noble, 7th of December 2016. Yep. And if you go to the top of page 2, you say, "Hi David, I'm reviewing our fire policy. And as part of the discussions with the H&S committee, there have been some questions about data on vulnerability. How is this captured? Where is it stored? How reliable is it? Are you able to advise, please?" And on page 1, if you scroll up, please, to that, you can see David Noble's response on the same day. And he explains how the data was captured in the first part of his email there. And then in the penultimate paragraph, he says, "We have a new supporting people policy that I wrote a while back. I've handed it over to Tom now, but it is live, though we need to do more work on publicising it." Now, was that the first time that you had tried to find out TMO data on vulnerable residents?
Certainly since the committee when we'd had that discussion. So I was obviously trying to get some details so that I knew that what I was going to put into the draft fire strategy.
Right. The committee meeting was on the 13th of September 2016, and this is 7th of December 2016. Why had you left it between September and December to ask the question?
I can't give you an answer to that.
Right. Had you seen the supporting people or vulnerability policy, whichever you call it, by that date?
I don't believe I had, no.
Right. Is this email the first time that you became aware of the fact that Dave Noble had produced a supporting people policy? Or that there was one?
I honestly don't know.
Right.
At this stage, I honestly don't know.
What was it that led to this question? What was it about the fire policy, particularly, that led you to ask this question about data on vulnerability?
Well, the minute that you just showed me was colleagues recommending that any changes to the fire strategy reflect the vulnerability policy, which I didn't know anything about. It hadn't, I think, at that stage been shared with me. So I appreciate there's been a delay, but I've clearly got it in my mind that I need to find out some more detail about what that involves.
Did he send you, or did you ask him to send you the supporting people policy?
I can't recall.
He says he's handed it to Tom, but it's live. Did you go and look at it?
I can't recall.
Right. Did you ask David Noble to share the information on how many individuals were recorded as vulnerable in the TMO stock?
I don't remember.
Right. Were you satisfied by his answer to your question? So you asked him, how is it captured, where's it stored, how reliable is it? And he's answered you. Were you satisfied by his answer?
Well, it's not comprehensive, is it? But it gives me a flavour of it gives me a steer of what's happening, and at least I have a better understanding of what housing management are doing to obtain the information.
Let's look at the document to which he's referring, the supporting people policy. This is at TMO 008800481. You can see at the very top of the document that it's got an operational date of April 2016. Author David Noble. This is version 1. It's entitled Supporting Residents Policy. And you can see the third paragraph there. The supporting residents policy is designed to ensure that we identify those residents who may need additional support, record what support is needed, deliver it where we can, and to help ensure that the work with any relevant agencies and make referrals to them where necessary. It also aims to make sure that in an emergency, relevant residents' needs are prioritised wherever possible. This document sets out the key aims and responsibilities to enable this to happen. This policy is supported by a procedure that sets out in greater detail the steps to be taken. Did you see this document either in April 2016 or in September 2016 or in December 2016?
I clearly hadn't seen it in April 16 or September 16, and I don't know if he sent me a copy. I imagine that he would have done when I contacted him in December. But it looks like at that point in time I hadn't known about it in detail.
Right. Did you ever thereafter, that is after December 16, see this document?
Can't recall.
Right.
How long is it? How many pages is it?
It is 4 pages.
No, sorry, I really can't recall. I may have done.
Well, we can scroll. I mean, I don't want to keep it from you. I mean, we can scroll down. Let's do that. Let's look at the bottom of page 1. There's a definition where there's no one agreed definition, and there's an attempt at a definition. On page 2, there's a list of vulnerabilities and potential solutions, aims, and then on page 3, identification and referral.
It doesn't ring a bell, actually.
It doesn't?
No.
Gosh, right. I mean, can you explain why you, as head of health and safety, did not see this document?
I can't, no.
Now, I've shown you and read to you the third paragraph on page 1. If we can just go back to that, please. If you hadn't read it, I suppose this question may not cut much ice, but do you agree that it's identifying the fact that residents might need additional support in the context of fire safety?
Indeed.
Yes. Do you know why there's no reference anywhere in this document otherwise to fire safety?
No.
No.
Which is why I don't think I saw it.
Now, there's a procedure that goes with it. I could probably take this quite quickly, given your answers. TMO 008804882. Supporting residents procedure. Have you ever seen this document before?
Doesn't ring a bell.
Right. How can you account for that?
I can't.
I mean, there's no reference to fire safety, no reference to referring residents for PEEPs, no reference to how the information gathered under the procedure might be used to generate a PEEP. Can you account for that?
No.
Was there any published guidance for TMO staff across the board to identify and address the fire safety needs of vulnerable residents? Any published guidance to that effect?
Is there any published guidance? I don't actually know. As I'm sat here, I can't think for sure that there was published guidance, which clearly there should have been, but I know that I would have regularly discussed it with housing management teams in their team meetings and with their managers.
Right. And similarly, no guidance, no standing guidance, procedure, protocol for TMO staff to identify and refer residents in general needs housing for PEEPs?
No, not formally, no.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you about your personal knowledge of vulnerable residents within Grenfell Tower. I'm going to show you an email run at LFB 401057. This is an email exchange in February 2016. And it is at the bottom of page 2, if you can see the email there, from Charles Batterby to you, dated the 4th of February 2016. And he says this: Dear Janice, I'm emailing to ask if you hold any information on the resident of 83 Grenfell Tower. Whilst carrying out a group risk visit to the block to offer residents a home fire safety visit, our crew spoke to a gentleman to the door of this address. The gentleman is blind and did not want to give us any details, and as a result, we were unable to gain access. I believe if we are able to contact him prior to the visit, this would reassure him of who we are. Our main concern is that there appeared to be tinfoil, I think, covering up the smoke alarm in the flat, which would compromise its operation and its effectiveness. Please contact me if you need any more information to support this request. Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, let's just reflect on this. Charles Batterby will be known to us as Crew Manager Batterby, the first firefighter from the first crew in attendance from G271 to enter the tower at 0101 on the morning of the 14th of June. And this particular individual who is blind was Elpidio Bonifacio, known to us as the last occupant of the tower to be rescued, leaving the building at 8:07 and 20 seconds. There is therefore a historical importance in this document, at least for those reasons. But let's just see how the story unfolds. If we go up in the chain, you can see in the next email in the chain that Siobhan Rumble responds and says, Good morning, Charles. The tenants of 83 Grenfell Tower are Mr. Bonifacio and Ms. Fernandez, and their telephone number is, and it's there redacted. Let me know if you need anything further. And then if we look further up, page 2, we can see that you respond or enter the discussion. I think we need the bottom of page 1 for the start of the email run. 10th of February 2016, you to Charles Batterby. Hi, Charlie, would you be able to advise on what date you visited Grenfell Tower to undertake the group risk visit you mentioned below? Please advise. And then Charles Batterby comes back to you and says, if we go up a little bit further, 13th of February, hi Janice, we visited Grenfell Tower. 2nd of February 2016, carried out home safety visits. The Green Watch tried to contact Mr. Bonifacio and Ms. Fernandez by telephone. They also knocked on the door of number 83 the following day whilst at Grenfell Tower. However, no answer on both occasions. And your response next day, thanks, that's very helpful. Now, would a PEEP have been considered appropriate for a resident who was blind?
Certainly needed further investigations. It may have required a PEEP, it may have required some other means of assisting or alerting, or it would need further investigation.
We could see from this email exchange that both you and Siobhan Rumble were involved in it.
Yes.
Did you consider whether to contact Mr. Bonifacio to offer him an assessment for a PEEP?
I should have done.
Do you know why you didn't?
I don't know why I didn't.
Now, as I've shown you, Charles Batterby had told you that the LFB had been unable to contact Mr Bonifacio again. Did you ask Siobhan Rumble or anybody else to follow up with Mr Bonifacio?
I can't recall.
Doesn't look like it.
I can't recall, sorry.
Let's look at another exchange about a vulnerable resident, TMO 00861013. Yes, and at the bottom of page 1, there's an email from you to Nicola Bartholomew on the 19th of October 2016. If we go to page 2, we can see you saying, "Hi Nikki, further to our communications about impending LFB audit of Barrandon Walk and also Grenfell Tower, I instructed our fire risk assessor to inspect both blocks yesterday and advise of any issues that require urgent attention. He has agreed to provide me with a written report on each inspection detailing any potential concerns. I should be in receipt of this tomorrow. However, the assessor has advised that there was a mobility scooter parked in the communal lobby outside flat 9, and this was being charged through the letterbox of the flat at the time of his visit. Paul has never made me aware of this. Were you aware? Did the residents seek permission to have a scooter in this area? And had we informed them of the ban on charging in the communal areas?" Now, we've seen that, in fact, Carl Stokes had indeed written to you and photographed the mobility scooter outside flat 9 and been quite strict with you about it. Did you follow up with Nicola Bartholomew about the outcome of the discussion with the tenant from flat 9?
Yes, and my recollection is that I think it was Robert Regan, the ESA, went and spoke to the lady at length and explained the issue with scooters and communal areas and charging. And my recollection is it was referred to Millicent Williams, who was the housing officer, who was liaising directly with the resident. And at that point, I think where it got to was they were investigating whether the scooter could be stored and charged on the ground floor in the hub room. So at that stage, from the information I've got, the resident is still able to come and go from the ground floor without the use of the scooter.
Well, my question is, would the fact that a resident has a mobility scooter not be a clear indication that they might need an assessment for a PEEP?
Yeah, they might do, yeah.
Yes. Did you yourself, or to your knowledge, Nicola Bartholomew or Millicent Williams investigate whether or not the occupant with the mobility scooter needed an assessment for a PEEP? Well,
it was kind of all tied up together that Millicent and Robert had spoken to the lady and were investigating whether she had the capacity for the storage and charging to be downstairs. So that linked to whether she could come and go to the premises without the use of the scooter. That was what we were trying to establish at that stage.
What did you establish?
Well, the last time I believe that's where we got to, that I was led to believe that she could come and go, and they were looking at the arrangements of whether that could be stored in that location.
Right, but you never got as far as the discussion for a PEEP, and so far as you know, nobody else did either?
No, believe not.
Right. 2017, let's move to that year. Can we look, please, at TMO 00869490? This is an email exchange in March 2017 between you and Daniel Wood within the TMO. And it's about block management. And if we go to page 3, we can see that Daniel Wood wrote to you on the 8th of March 2017. And he says, "Hi Janice, I'm working on an opportunity that may result in us taking on the management of blocks outside the existing stock, etc." He goes on to say, "I'm currently preparing a board report and will need to include something around H&S and FRAs. Can you let me have a bit of narrative, please, in terms of what the standard requirements would be for managing a new block of, say, 40 units?" And if you go to page 1 of that email run, we can see that you respond to him and you set out at quite some length the key provisions necessary for health and safety and fire safety. And if you look down, we'll need to scroll down to the last bullet point on that page, but if you do, you can see there that you say this: as residents are 60 plus, then it's possible that their physical ability may decline and they may struggle to self-evacuate. If this becomes the case, we should draft an individual personal emergency evacuation plan, PEEP, so clarify how this can be managed and any assistance that we are able to provide. Now, you suggest there that you would need to draft PEEPs for residents who are older than 60 and who struggle to self-evacuate. That's what you do. That's how I read that.
Yep, but I think that related to the block that he was asking for information on.
Right, so fair enough. But does this tell us that you did understand that PEEPs should be prepared for residents in some circumstances at least?
Yes.
Yes, but nonetheless you took no steps to prepare PEEPs in existing properties managed by the TMO, did you?
Well, no, I don't think that's a fair reflection.
Right.
We had a small number of PEEPs, and we gave assistance and sensory kit, and we worked hard with the hoarders, and there were things going on, but we weren't producing volumes of PEEPs, and as I've outlined before, we would have been constrained by what assistance we could provide from within the staff cohort, and that would have impacted on what we could do, but that would not have stopped us preparing them.
No. I mean, well, my point is really, I'm just asking you to accept that at this point, March 17, you understood that where there was a resident of a block that might struggle to self-evacuate because of their physical abilities, at the very least, an individual personal emergency evacuation plan needed to be drafted for them.
Not in every case, but yes, I've not disputed that there are occasions when that they will be required, and I think when I've referred to it in paperwork, that's what I said. PEEPs will be prepared if that's required. There may be other interim measures or other steps that are necessary which actually deal with the issue or enable people to self-evacuate. Maybe they just need assistance with alarms or whatever. There's a whole range of vulnerabilities and there's a whole range of responses, so it would have to be on an individual basis.
Now, I want to ask you about a different topic, which is fire safety information given to residents. Can we start, please, by looking at your first witness statement at page 53, paragraph 245. And you say there, under the heading Fire Advice Given to Residents between 2012 and 14th June 2017, fire risk assessments were available to residents on request. However, requests of this nature were uncommon. This could have been because we had a number of other systems in place for keeping residents informed on fire safety matters, which I've endeavoured to outline below. Now, just pausing there, was it made known to tenants that there were fire risk assessments for their buildings?
I am confident that when we wrote articles for the link, and I can certainly recall writing them where we said a fire risk assessment does exist for your building. It's reviewed on a regular basis. I'm pretty sure we'd have offered them. People did approach me for them, and we would have routinely provided them.
Yes, and I think it's right to say that your website contained reference to FRAs and the residents' right to ask for them.
Yes.
That's right, isn't it?
Yes, I believe so. And sorry, just to add that there were times when we routinely provided them when people were doing a right to buy or were selling a leasehold property. They were routinely requested. There were other circumstances, but those are the ones that come to mind.
Yes, presumably for mortgagees or banks or insurance.
Yeah, and also asbestos details and all of that kind of information. And also there were probably some residents' associations who were mindful of them being carried out and would sometimes request them.
So, from your perspective, an FRA was, to all intents and purposes, a public document.
Yes.
To be read by an
Yes.
innumerable range of people.
Yeah, I would have made them widely available.
And Mr. Stokes knew that too, did he?
I believe so.
So far as
he knew, then yeah. I mean, I know he puts that comment at the front that I don't really hold with, but anyway. Yeah. But yes, he knew that. There were our documents. We commissioned him to produce them in relation to our locations, so it's up to us what we did with them.
Just picking up on that answer, you say there was a comment at the front of it you didn't really hold with. Was that the bit about not showing the FRA to the London Fire Brigade?
Yes. We were always going to give the fire brigade any information that they wanted, and we always did. So I'm sure we had a conversation about that, but he felt that that was an accurate interpretation of the legislation, so I let it ride.
You never discussed whether it was appropriate to put that in his FRA or not with him?
Well, yes, sorry, that's what I was just saying. I would have discussed it with him and said, actually, is this right? Do we need to have this here? Because we're going to provide these to... No, that he was absolutely convinced that this was the proper interpretation of the legislation and therefore it needed to stay in.
Right, okay. Going back to your statement, paragraph 246, each new tenant receives a letter from TMO signed by myself and issued by either the voids officer or the neighbourhood team, advising them of the fire procedure and encouraging them to raise any concerns they had with us. Included in this letter was a copy of an LFB leaflet on home fire safety visits, which encouraged them to take up a free independent home fire safety visit from the LFB. We provided fire safety information to new and existing tenants and leaseholders on our website and through letters. Furthermore, regular fire safety information was included in the TMO's quarterly magazine Link, which was hand-delivered to all properties by a third-party company. Fire safety articles were also frequently included in Home Ownership News, which is a regular newsletter for leaseholders. And then you say, historically, all of our written communications with residents about fire safety advice were provided only in English. However, we would always have had a communication translated if a resident requested this of us. We expected residents to read the information provided and alert us if they were unable to. Who was responsible for ensuring that fire safety advice was provided in the letters to new and existing tenants?
I produced the letter.
You produced it. Who was responsible for ensuring that it was in there? Was that you?
No, it was given to. Most of the time, the sign-ups were done by. I think my colleague was called a voids officer. So I gave her electronically a copy of the letter and used to restock her supplies of home fire safety leaflets as and when she required them. So I produced the letter, but there was a pack of information that people got whenever they were taking up a tenancy, and it was incorporated into that, I believe.
Right. Who was responsible for ensuring that fire safety advice was provided on the website? Was that you as well?
Probably. Well, it would be my text. I would have just given somebody the text, and they'd be responsible for uploading it.
I see. And what about Link and Home Ownership magazines?
Again, they'd have been my information given to other people. The other thing that actually I realised I probably missed was the Residents' Handbook, and also we would have done regular newsletters to our specialised housing residents as well with this information.
To what extent was your approach to disseminating fire safety advice to residents informed by the LGA guide after the summer of 2011 at the least?
Yeah, reasonably.
Reasonably?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, that means I would have read it, and but also actually, just sorry, a bit of context to go back. I think when we had Salvus, one of the recommendations was that we do a letter to everybody in the stock to get them to confirm that they understood their fire arrangements. And I discussed that with my then line manager, Lornette Pemberton, and my communications colleague, and they said that actually their experience was that a letter to all the residents wasn't the most effective way of communicating with the residents, and that they recommended that we use the link, which also had the translation information on the rear cover. So I went back to Andy Furness and suggested that I do that instead, and he said that was equivalent. So certainly going back to 2009, that was the kind of thing we were doing.
Did you ever carry out a review of whether the means that you were using to communicate fire safety advice were sufficient or appropriate?
Not a review as such. We were constantly looking at what other options were available. We thought about preparing a DVD. We asked other colleagues across the sector what they were doing, and there wasn't anything widely different to what we were doing that seemed to be absolutely the way to go.
Now, you referred to the Residents' Handbook.
Yes.
Just now. It's not in your witness statement. Is that an oversight?
Yes, it must have been.
Right. Now, do you remember referring to the Tenants' Handbook at your meeting with Carl Stokes on the 24th of September 2010?
I may have done.
You may have done. I mean, his letter refers to it. Let's look at
Probably
it.
then.
CST 403061, page 2. And this is under the heading Fire and Emergency Information for Residents. Ooh, no, that's not it. CST 403061. Page 2, Fire and Emergency Information for Residents, as you can see in the middle of your screen. And it says, prior to moving into their flat, all residents are issued with a handbook which includes appropriate fire safety advice and information in accordance with the advice in the HM Government Sleeping Risk Guide, section 7.2. And you'll remember what we looked at this morning. Yes, and that was it. And he goes on, the residents are given a tour of the building by a housing officer. The resident does not sign for the handbook or to say that they have received this information, but it is part and parcel of the resident's moving in programme. And that's what he said there. Did you give him that information? You must have done.
Yes, I must have done. And I was regularly asked to review and update the health and safety and the fire safety information in the residents' handbook. And in preparing to come here, I can see it got reviewed again in, it was either 2010 or 2011. So to the best of my knowledge, that was being issued to new residents to supplement the other ones we had in place.
Can we go to CST 402701? This is a second letter of the 27th of September 2010. We haven't looked at this yet.
Okay.
He sent you two on that date, and the subject is fire safety signage in residential buildings. If we go to page 7 in that 9-page letter, you can see that he says under fire notices there, the last paragraph, I therefore concur that as TMA supplies information to the residents in a variety of different ways, newsletters, residents' meetings and articles in the Link magazine, etc., fire action notices are not required to be displayed in the residential buildings. If contractors or employees in the building, they will know the evacuation procedures, etc., because of their induction and fire training. It gives an example of a fire action notice. Did you show Carl Stokes the residents' handbook at your meeting of the 24th of September 2010? The reason I ask is he doesn't seem to refer to it in there.
I actually don't recall if I did or I didn't.
Right.
I would feel confident that I would have shown him at least the health and safety and the fire safety information, whether it just be my version that I'd sent through to my colleague, but I don't recall.
Well, let's look at a handbook. IWS 401762. If we look at page 2, please. This is exhibit MR6, and MR is Mohammed Razoul, who was a resident of Grenfell Tower who has helpfully given evidence to this inquiry. And this is his tenancy handbook, and as you can see from the first page, although it's not particularly big, bottom right-hand corner, its publication date is 2004. Okay. If we go to page 21 in this document, you can see that on that page, in the first part of that page, living in a flat or maisonette, on the right-hand side, last bullet point, there's a reference to fire doors. These must be kept clear of obstructions and must be closed at all times, never wedge them open for any reason. It looks, from our review of this document, that is the only reference to fire safety in it.
That doesn't, as I say, in preparing to come, I find my email with my updated information, which went back to the policy team in either 2010 or 2011, which had a substantial amount more health and safety and fire safety information.
So you say this was updated, was it?
That's what my understanding was, yes.
Right. How often was the Tenants Handbook updated so far as health and safety matters and fire safety in particular were concerned?
Because of it was a hard copy document. So when they were reviewing it, they would review the whole document. So it wasn't possible to review individual sections. It was kind of all or nothing, right. which is why when policy colleagues were reviewing it, they would write to everybody who had contributed, said, here is the text that we're we're working to at the moment. What do you want to change? And I would invariably have reviewed and potentially updated. But yeah, there was substantially more than this.
So can you help me with something then? When Carl Stokes referred to the Tenants Handbook in his first letter of the 27th of September 2010 and said that residents were provided with fire safety advice about evacuation procedures, which Tenants Handbook was that? It's clearly not this one.
It doesn't seem to be this one. I didn't produce it, but I know it was fairly regularly updated. It was my understanding that it was fairly regularly updated because I was periodically asked to comment on my sections. So I really think there must have been at least one update since then.
Right. You haven't exhibited it or
I don't. I never
referred
sort of kept a hard copy. I really only had my text. So sorry. But yeah, this looks really old information.
Right. Now, let's go into 2009 then. TMO 1400368. TMO 1400368. This is the minute of a Health and Safety Committee meeting of the 19th of May 2009, as you can see.
Right.
And you can see that you were present at it.
Yes.
Yeah. If you go to page 2, please, paragraph 3, you can see it says this. Janice confirmed that some fire safety information had now been drafted for inclusion in the new Residents' Handbook, and this had been circulated to members for comment. So is it right that you first drafted fire safety information for inclusion in the Residents' Handbook at that stage, May 2009?
I don't know. I can see that you've given me a 2004 version, and there's very little in there, and we haven't got the appendix to this. I don't know if that was the first time I did or not. I find that really hard to believe, but I am.
Right.
I don't have the handbook, and I don't have the older versions, so I'm not in a position to say.
Do you know what prompted the inclusion of fire safety information in the new Residents' Handbook in May 2009?
I can only presume that the handbook was being reviewed and updated, and there was an opportunity for me to feed into it. As I say, it was either all reviewed, or we had to live with the old version until it was renewed. So it must have been at a review point.
Right. CST 403279, email exchange, August 11, between you and Paul Miller, page 2.
Exactly. That's the one. That was the one I was remembering.
Right. That's what you're referring to, is it?
Yeah, I remembered seeing this.
Right. This exchange indicates that the fire safety advice for the Residents' Handbook was still in draft form at that stage. Is that right? August 2011?
I don't know whether it was again in draft form. I don't know. I don't know how often they reviewed it.
Right. Do you know who Paul Miller was?
Yes. He's a resident.
Resident.
He was a resident who had a specific fire safety concern.
Yeah.
He didn't live in Grenfell Tower, he lived in the World's End estate.
Yes, indeed. And do you know why the Residents' Handbook had not been finalised, at least so far as fire safety advice was concerned, by August 2011?
No, I would have provided fire safety advice, and if they were reviewing the document, I would have had an opportunity to review it again. The discussion that we had with Mr. Miller on site, and I think the fire brigade, he raised some issues, and one of the issues he raised was, well, how do we communicate with the residents, and how do we advise those? And I said, well, actually, that's quite timely. I think I've been asked to review this, so perhaps you could feed into what I think is what we should be communicating. So I sent him a copy, and he seemed happy with it.
If we go up to page 1, we can see that you forward this email to Carl Stokes on the 18th of March 2013.
Yeah.
For info below is correspondence with Mr. Miller on the fire safety info for our Residents' Handbook, item 3 on the minutes for the meeting with Councillor Hargreaves. Was the Tenants' Handbook, at least so far as fire safety was concerned, was still in draft at this point, March 13?
No, I not as far as I'm aware, for sure. Mr. Miller had something that he was unhappy about, and we endeavoured to address that, and that ended up involving councillors and the fire brigade and on-site meetings, and it seemed to be he accepted the fire brigade's position, which was the same as ours. But he would raise the same issue every couple of years, and I think that's been raised again by Mr. Miller, and therefore I was revisiting the original email exchange that we'd had.
My question is really about whether or not the handbook was finalised and then updated, or whether it remained in draft.
Yeah, and all I can say to you is I would have provided my final information, and to the best of my knowledge, it was finalised and updated. And if there was a further review, I would have been consulted subsequently. I've got no reason to believe that it wasn't. I was just trying to explain the context of this email.
Right. So as far as you're concerned, the residents' handbook was finalised but updated from time to time?
Yes, that was my understanding.
Right. Can we then turn to the subject of fire safety letters for new tenants? At Tmo 0086591, please. This is a letter dated September 2016, signed by you. Tmo 0086591. Dear resident, fire safety in your home. This looks like a standard form fire safety letter for new tenants. Is that correct?
It is, yeah.
Were residents told that they could ask for that letter to be translated into another language?
Not directly as part of this letter, but as I say, it went into an induction pack, which was provided by my colleague, the voids officer. So there could have been any number of things. If there was a reason to translate, they potentially could have asked for all of it.
Right. Now, we can see that there's no reference in this letter to personal emergency evacuation plans. This is September 2016,
Yeah.
at a time when the vulnerable policy is being discussed. Are you able to say why there's nothing in here about PEEPs?
I'm not. What I would just reiterate is this was my colleague would meet on site with the individual and talk them through the items in the induction pack, and would come away with a view of whether, and whether they had any support or required any support, or if there were any vulnerability issues. So they were quite well placed to come back with relevant information if we needed to take further action. And I think I didn't want to make it overly long. When you're new tenant and you're hit with a whole pile of information, I wanted to make sure that they would read it and digest it.
Well, it wouldn't make it overly long if you had an extra part at the end saying, if you have any disabilities or vulnerabilities, please let your neighbourhood officer or housing manager know.
No, indeed.
No. But it didn't. Now, is it right that Moira MacDonald was supposed to distribute these letters?
Yes. Most of the time she was the voids officer, I believe, so yes.
How did you know whether she did provide that letter to new tenants? Was there a system?
There wasn't a system. I would speak to her on a regular basis just to confirm that she was still doing it. Sometimes she would show me that it was in the pack where she'd pre-prepared packs. And also I would ask her if she needed additional copies of the home fire safety leaflet, which we got from the operational teams at the fire brigade, and they would often bring to our liaison meetings.
Right. Now, you've also referred to regular articles on fire safety in Link magazine and Home Ownership newsletter.
Yeah.
How often or how regularly did fire safety articles feature in those magazines?
I don't know, actually.
Was there a programme of fire safety advice to be distributed in the newsletters, or were
it was probably more ad hoc than it should have been.
When you say ad hoc, you mean responsive to a particular
Not necessarily
event?
responsive, just sometimes I would think, I haven't put anything in for a while. And in terms of the home ownership news, it was produced by the home ownership team, and their sort of kind of assistant director would contact me on a regular basis to say, I'm producing another one. Is there anything that you want me to include? And so sometimes it might be gas safety, sometimes it would be fire safety, sometimes it would be relating to flat entrance doors. So there were kind of different things that we would put in.
Do you know why the fire safety advice was disseminated through these publications rather than in a dedicated circular, a leaflet, say?
No reason. That these things were, I suppose, already in existence, and to go back to the kind of original advice I'd been given by the comms team, that they had found it to be more well received, and that residents, the impression or the research that they'd done indicated that residents preferred the information in the way that it was provided.
Right.
And sometimes I think the concern was if you send somebody a bespoke letter about one particular issue, it might not actually get opened, whereas if it's a magazine. I don't know, I can't really comment, I'm not a comms person, I was just, that's what I was...
No, the reason I ask is because the LGA guidance, which you were familiar with, referred to campaigns of leafleting and other initiatives in order to keep the fire safety message fresh. You'll recall that, yes? It's paragraph 77.2.
Yeah, and sometimes we have distributed fire brigade leaflets through all the high-rise, and we would have occasionally done things like that. So there were different initiatives.
So you did do that, did you?
We did. We didn't do it regularly, but we had done it, and I recall at the time, just before we appointed Salvus, I think we did all of the high-rise blocks with fire brigade leaflets, and we would have done it periodically.
Did all leaseholders receive homeowner newsletters and Tenants Link magazine?
Yes, there were several who wished not to receive the Link magazine, several leaseholders particularly, and they were omitted from the circulation because that was their choice, but yes.
Now, the Link magazine, at least, was published in English, wasn't it?
Yes.
But there was a flyer at the end, wasn't there, saying that residents could request a translation.
That's my understanding, yes.
Yeah, let's just look at an example of that. Tmo 00873 Mr. Chairman, we'll look at this and then I would ask for the break.
Yes, very well.
Okay.
This is linked, or link,
Link.
which wishes all the readers a Merry Christmas, for this is the Autumn-Winter 15 issue.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to page 40, there is a flyer which says, do you want this information in any other format or language? You see that?
Yeah.
Was that the only means by which residents were informed that they could request a translation of fire safety advice?
I don't know. I don't know if there was anything on the website.
Right.
But in general, for a while we had, I think it was called Language Line. There was a sort of an active translation that could be done on the telephone, which all of my neighbourhood colleagues particularly knew firsthand. So there were, and I recall certainly having to get procedures translated into Spanish in various locations.
Right. And you can see that the question and the invitation in English there are translated into 7 languages.
Yeah, I believe there were a core 7 languages at the time that were recognised back in 20. I don't know. I don't know if it was a borough approach or it was just to do with the quantities of.
Well, I was going to
languages
ask you,
spoken.
what if they only spoke Amharic or Telugu or Cantonese?
I'm sure they could have requested anything, but these were the core languages that the residents spoke from the assessment that had been done, I believe.
Right. But what if they didn't speak any of those languages?
Well,
Then what?
that's the point I'm making, that they could request it in any language. We had Language Line, we had access to other translation facilities, and they weren't exclusively these, but these were the main languages that our residents spoke.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. Thank you. We'll have a short break now. Ms. Wray, we'll come back at 25 to 4, please.
Okay.
And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out. All right?
Thank you.
Right. 25 to 4 then, please. Thank you. Would you ask Ms Wray to come back in, please? Right. Good. Right. Ready to go on again?
Yes.
Thank you very much. When you're ready, Mr Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. We're going to spend a bit of time still on the subject of fire safety advice. Can I turn to fire safety advice during the Grenfell Tower refurbishment next? During the Grenfell Tower refurbishment, who was responsible for providing updates on fire safety for residents?
I would have seen that as being the project team's responsibility, because they knew what was happening in the programme and what the impact of that would be on the residents. So I would have seen that as something that they would provide in their newsletters and keep me appraised.
Right. You see, Claire Williams says that she wasn't responsible for providing fire safety advice to residents, only for preparing refurbishment newsletters. Would you agree with that?
She could and she did consult me about what the advice, how it would be worded, how it could be included in the newsletter, but she was the person who was communicating with the residents, and she had a vehicle for such.
That doesn't quite answer my question. Of the two of you, Claire Williams and you, who was answerable for providing updates on fire safety advice to residents of Grenfell Tower?
Well, I suppose it must have been both of us, because I couldn't have provided information unless I knew what was happening in the project and the impact of that upon the building and the residents. And she knew what was happening and could advise me, and therefore, so it was probably a joint initiative.
Right. I'm not sure she saw it that way, you see. She told us that it was for the health and safety team to ensure that residents received fire safety advice. Just the reference for that was day 121 at pages 19 to 20. Do you agree with that?
In the normal scheme of things, it would be the health and safety team who provided that information, but without having input from the the project team, we wouldn't have been necessarily able to provide up-to-date information. So that's the point I'm trying to make, is that we couldn't have done it in isolation the way we normally would without significant input. Right.
Yes. Was there therefore any plan, any strategy to provide fire safety advice to residents while work was continuing?
I don't know if there was a strategy. It was something that we discussed periodically. Claire, as you probably appreciate, we invited her to come to our regular fire brigade liaison meetings, so we were actively looking at kind of fire safety issues in relation to the project, and as and when she was doing newsletters to incorporate that information, she would get my input.
Now, from a review of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment newsletters, which were distributed between September 2013 and May 2016, really the period of the refurb, we can only find two which refer to fire safety advice. One in July 2014, the July 2014 newsletter, and the May 2016 newsletter. Did you know that those were the only occasions on which fire safety advice was given to residents of Grenfell Tower during the refurbishment?
No, I didn't. But I was under the impression that there was also some information on notice boards, and there was other means of providing information as part of the project.
Well, let's look at the first newsletter. TMO. Well, this is what she says in her statement about it. TMO 008400364. This is Claire Williams' first witness statement at page 38, please. Let's go to page 38, paragraph 210. She refers to the stay put advice there, and she says that the entry in the newsletter was in part prompted by emails sent by Editor Farn, noting that he believed Ryden's site compound was taking up the Grenfell designated evacuation meeting point. The entry was to reinforce the fire safety strategy and instructions and guidance of LFB that all occupants except those occupying the flat where the fire was should remain in the flat rather than evacuate to a meeting point. And she goes on to refer to an email exchange between you and Ben Dewis on the previous page, if you go back to that, page 37, paragraph 209. Now, where she says the position was relayed to me by Janice Wray following her exchanges of correspondence with Ben Dewis of LFB on the 8th and 9th of July 2014. If we go to that, it's TMO 100006875, page 2. and you can see in the third email down from the top on page 2, Ben Dewis writes to you and says, "Dear Janice, I received this email below from an Emma Defon, who you may be aware of, who lives at Grenfell Tower." And then he goes on to say, at the bottom, the contractor has contacted the local station to inform them of changes to access points and riser access. The local station are making arrangements to carry out a familiarisation visit for local crews. Unfortunately, it would appear the same courtesy has not been given to residents to update them on their emergency procedures. Could I ask what the measures being taken in regard to fire safety at the premises are during the refurbishment works? Now, we can see that this is then forwarded by you to Claire Williams. If you go to page 1 at the bottom, you see that?
Yes.
And you ask, do we need to write to residents? Do we need to write to residents? It's the second line in the first paragraph on the issue of fire safety during the works. You see that?
Yes.
And then you say, we could put something together to reassure them that there is still a stay-put strategy and reiterating the procedures they should follow, works in hand to enhance fire safety in the longer term, etc. Perhaps this has already been done, ? I need to respond to this man and would like to be able to emphasise what we have already done, meetings, letters, etc. Why were you not aware of what fire safety information had been provided to residents to date?
Because I wasn't part of the project team, and I had at that stage assumed that it was something that the project team had in hand.
Right.
And so I didn't have that information, which is why I'm questioning her and assuming that that's already being put in place.
Now, you suggest putting together information to reassure residents, and then in the last line you say you want to emphasise what we have already done. Is it that you didn't want to admit that nothing had been put in place?
Well, just to reiterate my answer to your last question is that I didn't know what the project team had done, and so I wanted to be clear what that was. And if there were gaps, then clearly we needed to plug them, but I didn't know. I wasn't part of that team.
Right. Why didn't you just ask Claire Williams, well, what has been done?
Well, I think that's just my long-handed way of saying that.
I see. If we then go, please, to TMO 1000753, page 5, and over to page 6. Let's look together at the foot of page 5 over to page 6 in this email run. We can see that you write to Ben Dewis same day. It's a different email chain, but this is part of the same correspondence. And you say, "Hi Ben, thank you for your email. I've spoken to my colleague Claire Williams, project manager for the work at Grenfell Tower, and we would advise as follows." And then you go on to explain some background, and you set out a number of measures that you're taking on the fire safety strategy. And in the second paragraph, second bullet, at the top of page 6, you say this: "A newsletter is being sent to all Grenfell residents on a regular basis with updates on the works, and I can confirm that the July newsletter, which is currently being drafted, includes confirmation of the block's stay-put fire evacuation strategy, what this means for the residents, and the intention to maintain this for the duration of the work." Now, you don't say there that that step was being taken in response to his email, do you?
No, I don't.
But it was, wasn't it?
Well, that's the first time I became aware that the project team hadn't already been writing to residents to confirm their fire safety procedures. Sorry,
Yes.
that's at that point I didn't know. So you're absolutely right, but I didn't.
Why didn't you tell Mr. Dewis that you had not, at that stage so far, provided any fire safety advice before being prompted by his email?
I don't know. I don't know whether there was already information on the notice board, or I don't know. Most of the information I had to glean from Claire, and then advise Ben.
Right. Now, the next newsletter with fire safety advice was May 16. That's at JRP 6028, please. And if we go to page 4, that's page 1. If we go to page 4, you can see the fire safety advice in the second arrow, the stay put fire policy, and you can see what's said there. I won't read it all out to you. That's how it appears. If we look at the email exchange between you and Claire Williams on this subject, this is at TMO 00860222. Now, this is an email from Claire Williams to you, the 29th of April 2016. Janice, yesterday's demonstration went well, apparently. And then in point 2, towards the foot of the email, she says, they asked how we publicise our stay-put policy. I attached the relevant newsletter, and I will put this in the May 2016 one again. Now, you can see from the attachments at the top of that page that the relevant newsletter was the one from July 2014. Yes?
Yes.
Although it doesn't say 2014, take it from me that it is. It says July version 9 PDF. It looks from this email, do you agree with me, that the fire safety advice was only provided to residents during the refurbishment on the request of the London Fire Brigade? In other words, after a prompt.
It looks that way, yes.
Do you know why the TMO didn't have a...
It just helped me, but I'm a bit puzzled because nothing had changed, had it? Why was it...
No, it hadn't.
Sorry, just a minute. Is it being suggested that something had changed during the course of the refurbishment to render the previous fire advice redundant?
No, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm simply seeking to probe whether or not... Well, I think I have the answer, that the publication of the fire safety advice, so far as you see it in the 2 newsletters, was prompted by requests or suggestions from the LFB.
It was only a reiteration of what had always been.
Yes, there's nothing that changes in the advice itself.
No.
No. So my question then is why did the TMO not have a proactive plan to inform residents about fire safety during the refurbishment, rather than being prompted by the LFB to do it?
I can't give you the answer to that. Just would reiterate that my understanding was that there was information in the notice boards throughout the whole period of the refurbishment, so it was on hand. People have had information in the newsletter. There are resident liaison officers and people on site who could be, or people can ring me, or there are lots of opportunities to ask questions, but it hadn't changed. It was the same. So I can't give you a satisfactory explanation.
I want to turn now to the topic of fire action notices in TMO properties. Can we go back, please, to CST 402701? This is the second letter of the 27th of September 2010, following the 24th of September 2010 meeting. We looked at this earlier. And you can see the title, Fire Safety Signage in Residential Buildings. And you can see in the first paragraph, he says, during our meeting on Friday 24th September 2010 at the Hub, etc., you asked me to comment on the issue of fire safety signage for residential buildings under the control of the TMO. And he goes on to say there are 4 different varieties of fire safety signage you may encounter in a building, these being, and he sets them out. Do you remember why you asked Mr. Stokes for that advice?
I think I was probably just seeking clarification of what was required. I don't know whether I felt I'd been getting conflicting information from different guides or perhaps from different views from different fire officers. I'm not sure. I believe I was seeking clarification.
Well, we'll look at the letter in a little bit more detail in a moment, but I may be able to help you with your recollection. Can we go back to the Salvus document of the 22nd of September 2009 at SAL 6013? This is the fire risk assessment for fire safety policy and procedures. And it's the 22nd of September 2009. If we go to page 10 in that document, and look, please, at paragraph 7.2, they have identified as a hazard the lack of or inadequate information and instructions to tenants and contractors And in italics, under the existing control measures in place, you'll see it says fire action notices are not displayed in properties where there is no fire alarm system, and it is reported that tenants are not provided with specific individual emergency plans based upon their own building layout.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the next page, page 17, action. This is in the action part, the action plan. Correspondingly, with 7.2, you can see it says under 7.1, it is recommended that fire action notices should be displayed in all TMO managed properties, setting out the fire action procedure for the specific property as per LACOR's guidance. Mm-hmm. You see that?
I do, yeah.
At 7.1. Do you remember that recommendation? Do you remember the hazard and the recommendation that went with it?
No, not especially, actually.
Was it your understanding that the fire action procedure was to tell residents what actions to be taken in the event of a fire?
Well, yeah, advise them. Yeah.
As opposed to exit signs and matters of that nature?
Yeah, sorry, fire action... Apologies, could you repeat that?
Yes. Was it your understanding that the fire action procedure, which should be set out in accordance with the action required, what was a document which told residents what they should do in the event of a fire?
Fire action procedure, to my mind, is the same as a fire action notice, where you're setting out the procedure people would be expected to follow in the event of a fire.
Yes, I think we're saying the same thing.
I think we are.
The notice sets out the procedure, yes?
Yes.
And the procedure is to tell people what they do step by step if there is a fire.
Indeed.
Yes. Now, my question is, having shown you the defect, hazard, and the action plan in September 2010 as identified, September 2009 as identified by Salvus, was it that which caused you to ask for Carl Stokes' advice exactly a year later in your meeting of the 24th of September 2010?
It may have been, because LACOR's was largely concerned with sort of HMO-type properties, and so I can understand in HMO-type properties it's really crucial to have fire action notices displayed because of the shared parts and potentially the elevated risk, whereas we're talking about purpose-built self-contained premises, and I was maybe just seeking reassurance that that was what we were required to do.
Right. Did you read that as limited to HMO premises? In other words, I think it's housing in multiple occupation. Or did you read it as applicable to all TMO managed property, as it says?
It says all TMO managed property. My point was that my interpretation of LACOR's is that it was very much focused on HMO type properties, not necessarily the properties that we were managing. Right.
Now, before we get back to September 2010, there was some earlier history, I think. If we go, please, to RBK 30's52572, and this is the minute of the progress meeting that you attended with Salvus and much more of RBKC on the 26th of January 2010. RBK 30, there it is. We looked at that a number of times now. If we go down to paragraph 2.4, you can see in the second line it says, there was then a lengthy discussion about the desirability of having a notice at the main entrance of each block to document the emergency procedure in relation to that specific block. This would have the advantage of being accessible to all residents, visitors, contractors and staff. However, it would obviously only be available in one language unless diagrams were used instead. Therefore, JW felt that this should be done in addition to sending a letter to the residents which could be offered in the core languages. Clearly, this notice would need some consideration, etc. Now, the action list there, as you can see at the bottom, was for you to email a draft letter to Salvus for a comment, yes?
Yes.
and also to raise with area review boards. RT asked JW to raise with the TMO executive team and possibly raise with area review boards. So there were two actions there, yes?
Yes.
What was the area review board?
The area, I think we divided the stock up into 8 sort of geographical patches, 8 areas. In each area, the residents' associations got together and had a pot of money each year that they could spend on works that they wanted to do. I don't think it was a huge amount of money, but sometimes it might be landscaping, those kinds of issues. If they had particular local priorities that couldn't be funded in other ways, that was one way. So they were being consulted about what their preferences would be in terms of spending the money. They probably had, I think they were consulted about all sorts of policy and strategy, and they met regularly, but that's what I do remember, that they did have some budgetary control.
Now, do you remember whether there was a conclusion that the signs should be diagrams or one language?
No, I don't.
Was the intention to put these notices up in all residential blocks in the TMO stock?
The discussion was obviously here about a notice by the entrance point, and I think there was still some degree of pondering about whether that was actually going to be helpful or useful, and I'm wondering if there was going to be some consultation with the residents via the area review boards about whether that would work for them or whether they wanted to propose an alternative. I'm sort of speculating, but that seems to be what it's saying.
Do you remember whether this question was raised with the area review boards at all?
I wouldn't have attended their meetings, so I'm not really clear.
What about the TMO executive team? Was that question raised with them?
Sorry, I don't know at this stage.
Right. Did you draft a letter to Salvers for comment?
No, because as we spoke about earlier, the steer that I was given from my line manager and our comms people were not to do a letter, but to do an article in the Link magazine.
I see.
And I discussed that with Salvers, and they seemed to think that was of equivalent status.
Right. Now, in May 2010, there was an operations committee meeting. Let's look at the minutes for that. TMO 100-37437, page 89. We better look at page 88, in fact, first to see that you were there. You see that?
Yep.
And on page 89, agenda item 5, you can see that there is a report on fire risk assessments there. You see that?
Yep.
It goes on to say in the third paragraph down, it was agreed that fire instructions would be provided for each block. Further details on how this would be done in conjunction with other work arising from the assessments would be brought to the next meeting. Mm-hmm. Is that a reference to fire action notices there?
I think it must be the
Right. Do you remember whether anything was done at that time or thereafter, or at all in 2010, but before your discussion with Carl Stokes on the 24th of September 2010 about fire action notices?
I don't recall.
Now, we've seen from the letter that on the 24th of September you asked Carl Stokes to provide advice on fire safety signage.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the 27th of September letter, the second one of that date, CST 402701. Do you remember receiving the letter? I'm sorry, I'll wait for it to come on the screen. There it is. Do you remember receiving this letter?
Not especially, but I clearly did.
You clearly did. And if we go to page 6, you could see the beginning of his conclusions at the foot of that page, and you have exit signs there, you see. Mm-hmm. If you go over to page 7, he particularly deals there with fire notices, you see.
Yes.
And then he says at the end there, and I've read this passage to you already, I therefore concur that as TMO supplies information to the residents in a variety of different ways, newsletters, residents' meetings and articles in the Link magazine, etc., fire action notices are not required to be displayed in the residential buildings. Did you follow that advice?
I believe that I did, but I think that what confirmed it was obviously the publication of the LGA guide, which also indicated that fire action notices in buildings of a relatively straightforward layout didn't have to be on display. So that sort of confirmed that in my mind that what he had sort of indicated was appropriate for those blocks.
Was the result of this that you therefore did not take steps to make sure that fire action notices were displayed in the TMO's residential buildings?
Not at that time. Well, not all of them. Obviously, where there were shared facilities and specialised housing and temporary accommodation or whatever.
General needs housing?
General needs purpose built. No, I don't believe we did at that stage until quite a bit later.
Did you explain that to the TMO executive team or the TMO operations committee?
I don't know that I did, but I'm pretty sure I would have explained it to my line manager, and if she needed me to explain it to them or include it in a report, then clearly I would have done.
Right. Did you ever get formal sign-off from either the TMO executive team or the operations committee or the board or RBKC not to have fire action notices displayed in the purpose-built blocks within the TMO stock?
I didn't get formal sign-off, no.
Did you tell the LFB that you'd been advised that you did not need to put up fire action notices and weren't going to as a result?
I didn't, but any discussions I ever had with the LFB, they were mostly pretty low-key about fire action notices until the Adair fire. And they weren't being requested in deficiency notices or anything. So I don't think it was, my impression was it wasn't something they felt strongly about.
Now, you said a moment ago in your evidence that you, correct me if I'm wrong and I've misunderstood it, that you were in not putting up action notices following the LGA guide.
I know the LGA guide didn't come in until the following July. What I'm saying is my impression was that when the LGA guide was finalised, it was in keeping with the advice that Carl had provided.
Right. Does that tell us that when it came out, you went to the LGA guide and checked it and discovered, so you thought, that it was consistent with the advice that Carl Stokes had given you previously?
Well, I would have went through the LGA guide when it was published and looked at all the aspects of it, and that was something that stayed with me. Right.
Well, let's just look at it. HOM 3045964, page 116, please. And if we look together at paragraph 77.4,
yep.
It says, general advice to give to residents on domestic fire safety and preventing fires in the home is available from, and then there's a web link, protect yourself in your rented home, which is guidance on electrical safety and is also available in both printed and online form from the Electrical Safety Council. It is important that needs of non-English speaking residents are taken into account. Fire safety information in a number of alternative languages is available to download. And then Appendix 4 to this guide also contains suitable content for basic advice to include when communicating with residents. Basic fire action notices are usually the simplest means of conveying to residents the actions they should take in the event of a fire. Mm-hmm. Then if you go to page 118, paragraph 79.1, preparing for emergencies, I think we've looked at this before today, but it says, again, it is a requirement of the FSA that there should be a suitable emergency plan for the premises. Rarely in purpose-built blocks of flats will it be necessary to have a more elaborate emergency plan than a simple fire action notice. See Appendix 5 for examples. Nor will it be universally necessary to display such notices. Indeed, it's more common not to display notices, but to convey this information to tenants in other ways, for example, through residents' handbooks and so forth. Now, first, when this guidance came out, did you seek any further advice from Carl Stokes about whether or not fire action notices should be put up by the TMO in its purpose-built blocks of flats?
I don't recall doing so.
And now I've read you two parts of this guidance. Which part did you think you were relying on as consistent with Carl Stokes' previous advice that you did not need fire action notices?
Nor will it be universally necessary to display such notices in fairly simple layout blocks of flats.
Right. Yes. Did you go back to Carl Stokes and ask him, given the way in which that is phrased, in which blocks he thought, in his professional opinion, it was necessary to display such notices, and in which blocks it was not?
I didn't ask him that specifically, but he was undertaking fire risk assessments and I was getting information on a block-by-block basis. So I therefore expected to receive it as a significant findings action plan in the blocks where they weren't displayed where they were required.
Did you ever get any advice in relation to any particular block that for that block a fire action notice should be displayed?
As I said, specialised housing guides where we have communal lounges and such like. If we may have had some temporary accommodation with similar. In fact, there was at least one. And any assessments he did on any of the workplaces. But not purpose-built.
No.
That I can recall now.
So did that tell you that Carl Stokes wasn't about, his task did not include specifically identifying general needs housing in purpose-built blocks and picking those which did and those which did not need fire action notices? In other words, he wasn't doing the exercise of bringing his judgment to bear to decide where they were required and where they weren't.
Well, I believe that he was. It was his view that they largely weren't required in the properties we discussed. I believe he did have a view on it. I'm sure that he was as aware of this and all the other guidances.
Did you ever have a discussion with him about him going around those blocks and asking himself where they were and where they weren't needed?
I very well may have done, but I certainly would have expected that to be part of his fire risk assessment approach, that when he's in a building, that's one of the things that he considers. I'm fairly sure that's something that I would expect to be done under PAS 79.
You can't tell there, can you, from the face of any of his FRAs that we've seen, whether he actively did consider whether or not for that building a fire action notice should be needed or not?
He hasn't made it explicit that he's considered it. No, you're
and therefore
right.
You don't know whether he's brought his mind to bear and discounted it in each case or simply not thought about it.
I don't think I can answer that, no.
No. And that you can't answer it because you didn't think about it either. You didn't ask the question of yourself that I've just asked you.
Well, I did think about it. I did think about it. And we have a specialist consultant in fire. I'm reading the guidance and I've got my interpretation, which I think applies overwhelmingly to our purpose-built blocks. I realise that we've got other blocks with other risks, and I'm aware that they need to have action notices, and he's recommending those as well. So I don't think that's entirely fair.
My question, let me try my question in a slightly different way. Did you ever ask yourself the question, I wonder whether Carl has really thought about this. Has he actually thought about whether this block needs a fire action notice? Or did you ask yourself the question, has he discounted it completely for all blocks and applied a one-size-fits-all to them all? Did you ever wonder about that?
I may have done, but just, again, since overwhelmingly we were talking about purpose-built blocks of flats with no kind of shared facilities and a relatively straightforward layout, then if he was applying it one-size-fits-all, that was the size that fitted that kind of block.
Can we go to RBK 30299298, please? This is an enforcement notice dated the 23rd of December 2015 for Adair Tower. I know you're familiar with this document. Can we go to page 6 of it, please, where we see, among other issues, in the second box, Article 14, the LFB concluded in the second row in the table that there was, number one, no directional signage to indicate which staircase was to be used in the event of emergency. And then the next row below that, under Article 15.1, or Sub 1, it was found that emergency instructions for actions to be taken in the event of fire are not displayed within the common parts of the premises for visitors and other relevant persons. Now, you received that on the 23rd of December 2015. I take it that it made its way into your hands pretty quickly.
Actually, we didn't get it to the 6th of January. I don't really know the vagaries of the postal system or the email system, but when it arrived, it got to me quickly.
Yes. And we've seen some evidence which Laura Johnson and we discussed about that. But let's look then at the next LFB meeting. This is RBK 3013997. This is the note of the bi-monthly meeting with the LFB, 5th January 2016 at 10 a.m. We can see that you're there together with Claire Williams and 3 from the LFB, including Rebecca Burton.
Yes.
If we go to item 3, agenda item 3 at the foot of the page, Adair Tower enforcement notice. Janice confirmed receipt of Rebecca's email attaching this enforcement notice. So you had it by the 5th.
Electronic copy on the 4th, apparently.
Yes, so that sets that date there. If you go to page 2, you can see that it's minuted. First main paragraph, Janice asked. Do you see?
Yes.
Janice asked what arrangements the LFB required for monitoring progress. Then again, under that, Janice asked for confirmation that this notice refers exclusively to this block and that the TMO is not required to apply this to the rest of the blocks. Rebecca agreed that this does relate directly to Adair Tower. However, the LFB could expect that standards required in one block are also required in other blocks.
Yep.
And then Janice sought clarification on some of items on the schedule. Then if you look at the third bullet point down, Article 9.1 and Article 15.1, requirement for fire action notices. Janice advised that the TMO have not installed these notices previously as the buildings are not complex. They are subject to frequent use, there's a stay-put fire strategy, etc. Further to earlier discussions, are the TMO now expected to place a notice in every block? Question. Rebecca did not consider this to be a priority. Janice queried whether there was a specific wording that the LFB wanted us to use for this notice. Do you agree that you were aware by this time that the fire action notices would need to be installed in all other high-rise blocks in the TMO stock, at least according to the LFB?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to clarify.
Yes.
Because at no point previously had they requested them in any of their audits or any of the visits or any of our dialogue with the brigade. So this was the first time. And as you know, we were in receipt of a deficiency notice, which was within 2 weeks or so before the fire, which I actually didn't request them then either. So I was just trying to be absolutely clear what standard we're needing to meet.
Do you accept that at least at this point, even if not before, you are now aware that you needed to have a fire action notice in all of your blocks, at least your purpose-built high-rise blocks?
Yes.
Yes. Now, you can see that Rebecca said she didn't consider it to be a priority. What did you understand her to mean by that?
That was just her personal view. Right. There are other things that she would have wanted us to prioritise, which seems sensible, but it didn't make it optional, and I didn't interpret it that in that way. Right.
What steps did you take after this meeting to ensure that fire action notices were installed in all blocks?
I would have escalated, I did escalate this and send a copy to Barbara Matthews, my line manager, which clearly clarified that the issues that the fire brigade had raised with us in the enforcement notice were expected to be met elsewhere. So that's so I escalated to executive team level, really.
I want now to turn then to the role of RBKC in fire safety advice. Okay. Can we start, please, with TMO 00865 Now, this is an email on the 14th. Yes. If we go down, please, to page 3. First of all, in this chain, you can see that here is an email from Councillor Mason at RBKC to Robert Black of the 14th of April 2016. Subject, fire safety information. Dear Robert, fire safety information to residents. Now, just placing it in its chronology, this is 4 months after the receipt of the enforcement notices for Adair Tower and Hazelwood. Mm-hmm. At the last meeting of the Cabinet and Corporate Services Scrutiny Committee, where there was an update on the Adair Tower fire, it was noted that fire safety information is provided to residents on the TMO website. One committee member wondered if this was adequate, given that not all residents would have access to the internet for various reasons. Is this information provided to residents in other ways? Now, you, I think, got this email because Robert Black referred you to it, and we go to page 1, we can see that he did so, and you responded on the 15th of April. see that.
Yep.
Dear Councillor Mason, and you go on to say that I can confirm that this is provided in a number of ways, and you go on to set out what those are, including home visits, letters, leaflets, link, home ownership, etc. And you go on to say, specifically in relation to Adair and Hazelwood Towers, we will shortly be installing fire action notices, setting out the action to be taken in the event of a fire in the flat and also elsewhere in the building.
Yes.
And then you go on to say on the next page, where you continue, our fire risk assessor, this is the pre-penultimate paragraph, our fire risk assessor regularly posts LFB leaflets through residents' doors as part of his assessment. Now, first of all, was it the case that you were only putting up fire action notices in Adair and Hazelwood, or was there a more general concerted plan to do so across the borough?
We needed to have a plan to do so, and we acknowledged that. But at that stage, I hadn't been given a budget or the go-ahead to proceed with it, so I didn't feel that I could include that in my response to him.
Right. So you'd only had the budget and the go-ahead for those two buildings, the subject of the enforcement notice?
Yes. And to be honest, we were completely focusing on those because for obvious reasons. But it had been escalated, and it was recognised that we needed to move forward with it. But at that stage, I hadn't got the.
Well, you were moving forward with it at a glacial pace, weren't you? Because this is now 4.5 months after the 5th of January.
I'm only telling you the truth, that it had been escalated, and I hadn't yet been told I could proceed, so I wasn't in a position to proceed.
No, and I'm asking you to accept that in proceeding you were doing so at a glacial pace, even in respect of Hazelwood and Adair, 4.5 months after the bilateral meeting with the LFB on the 5th of January.
That's how it was.
All right. Now, on the question of the fire risk assessor putting leaflets through residents' doors, did you ask him to do that?
I can't actually recall if I asked him to do it or he volunteered to do it and just asked me to get him copies of the leaflets. I'm not sure. And I know it was, obviously he wasn't in a position to be doing that in every block. And my recollection is he possibly targeted maybe the smaller blocks.
Why did you ask Carl Stokes to do that rather than the ESAs?
I don't think I did ask him to do it. I think it was something that he volunteered to do, because generally you're right that when we were doing that kind of mail drop, we would either get a private company to do it or we would look for the estate services assistants to do it.
Right. Just to identify the leaflet, CST 30017272, is that?
I believe it was the Home Fire Safety leaflet, the one advocating providing information about what was available. Yes.
Is that it?
That's it.
That's it. Now, when he was asked if he posted leaflets in flats at Grenfell Tower, what Mr. Stokes told us is that he would say no, because there was a dedicated caretaker and it was part of Lancaster West, so the caretakers would have done it or the ESAs would have done it. That was at day 139 at page 101, lines 9 to 14. Do you know, or did you know, that Carl Stokes was not posting leaflets at Grenfell Tower because there was a caretaker?
As I say, I don't think it was something that he was doing universally, and I wasn't expecting him to be doing it universally. And actually, when I think back, I don't know the detail of which blocks. I thought he tended to focus on the smaller ones that he thought might be inspected less frequently, because our inspection regime with the caretakers was dependent on the size and the complexity of the building. So the smaller ones, therefore, were visited less often. So I think he saw that as being another way of making sure that the residents in those locations had some information.
Right.
Sorry, that was long.
Was there a system whereby you put this leaflet in enough copies into the hands of the caretakers or ESAs or housing managers so as to make sure that every single resident had one of these in their home, rather than relying on Carl Stokes?
I think that we would have had copies of them at our receptions. I think there may have been times, for example, we spoke earlier about pre-Salvus, we did distribute to all of the high-rise blocks. So it was certainly done at that time in summer 2009. As we know, that the fire brigade were also undertaking their own home fire safety visits. When there was a fire, they would target the flats around that area. So they had their own initiatives that we weren't always aware of either. So there were various ways of doing them.
Can we look at TMO 100456642? We're still in April 2016, and this is a fire safety review of the fire safety strategy that you prepared in that month.
Yep.
TMO 100456642. And there it is, it's paper 6,
Yep.
and I'm assuming that it was presented to the Tmo Health and Safety meeting later that month. Is that right? It's paper 6.
Yeah, I presume so.
And if we go to page 2 of that document, you can see that it notes in this first main bullet point, stay put, evacuation strategy, better publicity. Why did you consider at this point, April 16, that you needed better publicity of your stay put strategy?
This is a discussion document for things that we want to consider, and it seemed completely valuable to discuss whether there could be better publicity. I mean, we're also aware that we've got various means of advising people. I don't really know how effective they are. You know, it was up for discussion.
Why was it up for discussion? Why did you think you needed to minute a discussion of better publicity about your stay put evacuation strategy?
We were reviewing our fire safety strategy, so inevitably we were looking at comms, and most of our blocks have evacuation strategies, so that's why it's there.
What was the problem with the publicity that indicated that it needed to be better?
Well, I'm not suggesting that there was a problem, but it's a review of something that was written 3 years before, and therefore that's one of the things we considered, and along with a whole heap of others, you can see.
Yes. Did you take any steps to make the publicity better after this meeting? Or after April 2016?
I can't recall.
If we go to page 3, there are some comments that you can see from committee members.
Yes.
John Borrer, need to emphasise, reinforce stay put strategy at every opportunity. Do you know why John Borrer emphasised the need to reinforce the stay put strategy at every opportunity?
No.
Was there any discussion about that? Do you remember at the meeting at which this was presented?
No, I've just been emailed these comments and I pasted into the document so that everyone at the committee had access to them.
Right.
So no, not that I recall.
TMO 00840753, page 5. Well, page 1 to start with, you'll see that this is the minute of the Health and Safety Committee meeting, 13th September 2016. We've seen it before, but now we're on a different topic. You were there. Page 5, please. Agenda item 6, review of safety policy and strategy. You can see that there.
Yes.
We looked at this morning on the first bullet point, policy on vulnerability. Now let's look at the second bullet point. Agreed that we look to start installing fire action notices throughout the stock. Suggest that we adopt a risk-based approach, starting with potentially high-risk blocks. It was considered that as LFB included this in the enforcement notices, they're likely to start requiring these on their audits, and so wise to be proactive. Now that's a reference, isn't it, to the Adair Tower enforcement notice?
Yes.
Now, this is 9 months or so, isn't it, from your meeting on the 5th of January 2016 with Rebecca Burton and others from the LFB about the Adair Tower enforcement notice? Yes. Can you tell us why it took 9 months to reach the agreement that fire action notices should be installed in all stock?
No, I can't.
Do you know what caused the delay?
No, I don't.
If we go on then to TMO 00866-348, this is an email. If we go to the bottom of page 1, over to page 2, email at the bottom, Barbara Matthews to you, 13th of October 2016, and then up to the top of page 2, she says, Janice, I can see that the LFB are not being very helpful, as you say, are beginning to be more forceful about door closers. In relation to the stay-put policy and advising residents, they have again proposed fire action notices. As I suggested before, I think we should now put in place a programme to put fire action notices in all blocks, as this will only come up again and again. Please could you provide a cost to do this programme? Now, was the TMO being chased by the LFB in October 2016 to install fire action notices?
I think we'd received a few deficiency notices where this was now being included. It hadn't previously been something that they'd requested. Obviously, we sought clarification and they confirmed that they would be requesting it. So now, as and when we got a deficiency notice for a property, it included this particular request.
Can I just ask, did you ever raise with the LFB the, excuse me, the provision in the local government guidance, which said that, we looked at it earlier,
Yes.
you don't normally need to put them up? Did they ever?
I don't know that I did. As I say, they were auditing the blocks and we were sometimes getting deficiency notice and often getting broadly compliant letters. So they knew that it wasn't our policy. So it wasn't something that they raised with us until the Adair fire. I can't say that we had the discussion. We probably did, but I possibly didn't minute it, so I can't be absolutely clear.
All right, thank you.
Yes. Just looking at what Barbara Matthews is telling you here, she says in the second paragraph, second sentence, as I suggested before, I think we should now put in place a programme. Why was she having to chase you on that subject?
I'm not aware that she was chasing me. Once I had a budget and approval, I could go ahead and do because I'd already got the wording that I wanted, and we probably already had quotes and we knew what we could put in place. We'd identified the high risk blocks. I'm not aware that she was chasing me.
Well, she says, as I suggested before. Are you saying that she hadn't?
No, there's a difference in suggesting and actually saying, yes, there's a budget, go ahead and do.
Right.
I clearly hadn't had an instruction or I would have gone ahead and done.
Can you explain why she's having to repeat the point to you, that a programme for fire action notices now needed to be put in place in all blocks?
No, I can't. But hopefully Barbara can clarify that.
Right. Mr Chairman, the clock inches towards 4:30 and I'm some way away from finishing the topic.
Oh, well, is that a reasonably convenient point during this topic?
Yes.
Well, perhaps we ought to take the opportunity, should we?
Yes.
Yes.
Just bearing in mind that we will pick up tomorrow morning in November 2016.
Right. Well, there it is, Ms. Wray. We're going to stop now for the day. I'm afraid we have to ask you to come back again tomorrow, but I think you were expecting that.
I was.
And we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow, please. And in the meantime, don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room, please.
Thank you.
All right? Thank you very much. I'd like to go with the usher. Thank you, Mr. Willett. 10 o'clock tomorrow, then,
Yes,
please.
thank you.
Okay.